I got a phone call from the manager who actually said to me, "Lorraine, are you sitting down?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Lorraine," he said, "there's been an incident." He said, "I've just sent 2 of my staff down to the police station." And I said, "What do you mean there's been an incident?" And he said, "Jim has been badly assaulted." And he said, "We suspect it's not the first time." He said, "But I suspect it's the first time the girls have had the courage to come forward." He said, "Because you have to understand they're coming forward against their boss." The nurse in charge, the registered nurse in charge, who was the boss, actually stomped on Jim's legs, literally whilst he was in a wheelchair, restrained and couldn't move. He just literally just stomped on his legs.
Welcome to the Westminster tradition, where we are unpacking lessons for the public service, starting with the Robodebt Royal Commission. My name is Alison Lloyd-Wright, and I'm a recovering public servant and a managing director of the Good Trouble Group. Joining me today on Kaurna Land are my 2 fellow recovering public servants, Caroline Crozer-Barlow.
Hello, Alison.
And Danielle Elston of Good Government Advisory.
Hello, Alison.
In this mini-series, we're looking at the Oakden aged care scandal, which involved the prolonged abuse of elderly people institutionalised for acute mental health disorders, usually dementia. And just a bit of a warning, this episode's going to get a bit gnarly in some of that respect. In the last episode, we talked about how government couldn't make a decision about outsourcing the service, and so let it to fester, scandalously under-resourced for 15 years. Caroline, what have you got for us today? What next?
So, look, today we're going to round out this little mini-series by looking at the ways in which what was happening in Oakden was hidden from view from everyone on the outside, including more senior management in the corporate part of the local health network, as well as kind of outsiders. Because while some of the things that were happening at Oakden could have been worked out by looking on paper, like the age of the facility was apparent, staffing levels were apparent. Things like the toxic culture in the nursing practice weren't obvious, right? Like you can't see that on a piece of paper. So just to give one shocking example, the 2016 Chief Psychiatrist report uncovered a practice during their review called floor time. Let's have a guess about what that means. So they surfaced it because they were looking at entries in clinical records that said things like tends to lie on the floor or puts themselves on the floor. And so the reviewers go and they ask staff about it. They're like, what does this mean? And they're advised that during staff interactions with particular clients, the staff would leave the person on the floor if they formed the view that intervening to assist the person was not immediately needed for whatever reason. So we're talking about kind of 70-year-old people in kind of quite severe distress lying on the floor and just the other humans walking away.
Probably with poor mobility to remove themselves from that position as well.
With significant mobility constraints because of the level of the use of restraint, the decay of the ability to kind of move around independently. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. So as noted in the review, this is among the most abhorrent approaches to providing care to severely disturbed customers that any of the review had encountered in well over 110 years of collective experience of practice. Simply lacks any humanity. So, look, in today's episode, we're going to understand how you can have an organisation where something like floor time is a thing, the secrecy that enables that practice to thrive, and then how it actually came undone, because the story of it coming undone is quite, I don't know, what's the word, happenstance? Like it feels like it very easily could not have.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So one of those things that we've been thinking about is systems, people who work there and residents. But these people have families. And the elderly, that can be, so in different parts of health and social policy areas, how much family you've got have been different. Elderly people tend to have less family just on a statistical partner, husband may have died, that kind of thing. But they still have families. And if things were this grim, we have to kind of consider why those families who were in and out, they've gone past the closed hospital and visited mum or or their partner or their uncle or whatever else, why they must have known or seen things and why they couldn't raise the alarm. And one of the challenges I think with this, and I'm probably switching out of systems to anecdata, is the distribution of health and social care services actually depends a lot about how you interact with the service. So it is not a purple problem, purple solution. And I have been an advocate in this system a range of times, and I absolutely know how to get someone the best care. And it's to never show a single scrap of emotion, because if you appear in any way emotional about advocating for the person you're advocating for, there's a view that you are also dysregulated. It is to never be threatening. I have at one point, the only time one time I have said to someone, I hope on the phone, look, I hope I don't get to meet you in person at the coroner's court if your decision here turns out to have catastrophic consequences. That is a very unusual thing for me to say in those situations. I actually thought it was quite like a really valid thing for that person to consider, that the service we were looking for was someone who was incredibly suicidal, but it's not the right approach. It's never the right approach, because you have to be middle class,
Grateful.
clean, grateful, clear. You must at all times recognise how hard it is for staff. You must in some way say about the person you're advocating for, we know they're very difficult. I'm sorry for you. If you don't do those things, and I've stood next to people not doing those things, the services you need are removed from you, because there is a scarcity of services, and there always will be, and the choices as to who gets what and how you're responded to depends on how your family advocating for you does. The second part about it is less so probably in this situation, and definitely in what, again, this is not mental health, it's dementia. So I just have that strong view. But for people in a more of an in and out, so not a permanent care situation, they are often exhausted and grateful when the person they care for does get some kind of assistance. And the idea that they have any capacities of their own at that time, no matter how systemically aggravating they might be in their normal life, to write a long letter to the minister explaining what it looks like, to say, I'm sitting in this waiting room and you could easily save so much money over there and then do something over here. Even the best kind of nerdy government thinkers like that don't do that, because even if they can get past the gratefulness component and the need to keep the service on side, the second part is they are so shattered by their caring responsibilities, because this entire system is built on the idea that if you have family who will quit their jobs and look after you,
That should happen.
That should happen first.
Can we, though, talk about the permanency of this situation, because that is a factor here, right?
Absolutely.
You have a vulnerable family member who is full-time being cared for by these people about whom you wish to complain. Is there a fear that those people take something out on your loved one?
I mean, it is so clear that is what was driving some of the families not raising issues. And it's interesting that the family who does end up blowing the lid on this, their loved one has died by the time they really start making a big deal about it. And I think that says something, right? Like their loved one was beyond the place of retribution.
Yes.
And one of the things that persists to this day as a policy question, actually, is many of the families who had people at Oakden called for CCTV in aged care facilities as one of the kind of responses to this, and I think that shows to you that they felt you needed a kind of passive, non-confrontational way of managing this question, because it is actually very hard to say to someone, my loved one has unexplained bruising.
Yep.
Was that you?
And can I just also throw out that the additional complexity to this is unexplained bruising and a whole range of other things So a staff member will say, you have no idea what I'm dealing with. And the other reality of that is having if you've ever spent time sometimes with, I have described looking after someone with dementia as though looking after a toddler in a knife shop.
Yeah.
Because they're not a toddler and they have agency, but like there are knives everywhere basically. And so how much to intervene and not intervene and harm yourself but give you agency is not like it's – I'm not an expert at it, I suppose, and I'm expecting other people to be experts, but these are not 100% simple questions, right? Like if the three of us walk out of here, I was going to say, and someone has a black eye, there's been a problem, but we're quite clumsy, so that's probably not the best example. But like there's other situations that are more clear-cut to investigate than these ones, and that murkiness does give power.
Yes, it really does.
But still, shit was bad, right? How did it go unnoticed or uncommented upon or uninvestigated for so long?
Yeah, I will get to that, but just to say to Danielle's point, it wasn't just things like unexplained bruising. Like there's this testimony by one family member who talks about how his mother was always in the wrong clothes. Every time she was in a stranger's clothes, because they couldn't be bothered, right? Like getting the laundry right. And that he complained about it, and felt that it sort of was almost deliberate by the end that she was in the wrong clothes. And the last time he took her to take her to the dentist, she had poo in her hair. And for him, that felt like the culmination of a series of conversations about why can't you just put my mother in the nice clothes that I bring her? That felt like a retribution. And he had to take his mother out to. So anyway, that is not just. It's hard to look after people with dementia. That's just
that's not. So that's also not like an excuse or anything else.
No, I know it wasn't.
I think
but
when
I
it comes
just
to
want to say there was. It was more obvious, right? There were things that were clear cut.
Yeah.
Definitely weren't okay. So families fearing retribution, finding it hard to complain, and we'll talk a little bit about complaints in a bit. The second thing that's really obvious from the chief psychiatrist report is that there was this culture of secrecy, and in particular the chief psychiatrist notices as they go about the wards that they hear certain managers saying, boss on the floor. And the phrase boss on the floor...
Ducks on the pond, right.
Yeah. It has a cultural coding, right?
Yeah.
That is not boss on the floor, let's be smiley and nice. That is boss on the floor, hide the shit that you're doing to people. So, and that's helped because management wasn't on site. So if you're not there often, you can say boss on the floor. I mean, if you're there all the time.
Could get boring at that point.
Yeah, at some point. So this kind of idea that you kind of boss on the floor, you don't let people see what's happening, plays through into their approach to reporting incidents. So despite the fact that they're health practitioners, they've got mandatory reporting towards various practitioner bodies. APRA is introduced during this period of time, lots of different things. Internal practice was to deal with it in-house.
Yep.
So there's a pretty gruesome example of a failed catheterisation of a person without their consent for 2 hours. And an agency nurse sees this and sort of says to, one of the managers, we should report this to APRA. This was it was without consent. It was blah, blah, blah. And the manager says, we deal with these things in-house. So nothing coming in. And this another kind of way in which this was all kept together, I think this, Danielle, I feel like this will really appeal to kind of the way you think about things, is there was a very significant use of overseas nursing staff in Oakden because they needed mental health nurses. And Oakden was the only SA mental health facility that could take overseas nurses with quite limited scopes of practice. So you end up with these kind of limited scope of practice, often really poor English, no institutional connections to the unions, no institutional connections to kind of, knowing where your rights and your responsibilities are, and also on visas where they
vulnerable, at risk of exploitation themselves.
All of the things, right? And then
isn't the first time we've talked about these scandals where they have an higher than usual proportion of staff with no tenure, so their agency or whatever else, and that the vulnerability of the staffing cohort becomes borderline on purpose because anyone else wouldn't put up with it.
That's exactly.
Because they wouldn't have so much risk associated with their own, like they've got nowhere else to go. They've got responsibilities. So I do think that is always, I think it's a challenge. I think that the overseas training is different to the agency staff. I think remains agency staff are excellent, and agency staff, like casual staff, should be used for surge requirements, unexpected large amounts of sick leave, all of those types of things. They are not a baseline workforce. They should never be a baseline workforce anyway. Firstly, it's expensive and it's taxpayers' dollars. It is not the cheapest way to deliver services, but mainly also because they are not doing the training they're doing is always for the job. It's never that public sector training. It's never that other layers of kind of stuff.
Yeah, I find it really interesting that, like, of the unions that kicked off about Oakden, and it's like shout out to the Salaried Medical Officers Association, who are not always my favourite SA union, I would say, but they were really active in this space. But the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Association is much less active in this space, and I think that reflects something about that workforce composition, because they were still overseen by clinicians.
Yep.
But they were all FIFO clinicians as well. Like, recall, they're not located there all the time. So I don't think they knew there was scandalous under-resourcing. I'm not sure they understood what the culture on the floor was necessarily like.
Yeah. Have you seen other places with a culture of secrecy? How would you find one, or how would you know that if you're in one, what would you do about it?
I have definitely seen places and this kind of outpost phenomenon where the patterns of behaviour are quite different and quite more toxic than their equivalents elsewhere. I have definitely seen kind of, regional officers go down a path.
Yeah.
I don't know that I saw them as secret so much as people were like boiled frogs and did not realise how unusual what was going on was. So that's, I don't know that I've seen secrecy.
But that is, I think that is a contributing factor here, right? Is the isolation from any other similar service, the rest of the Northern Adelaide Local Health Network. It allows a culture, especially if no one comes to visit, no ministers, no execs walking the floor, it allows a culture to grow and develop in its own set of
and you don't realise
circumstances.
how different it is.
Yeah.
Sometimes, so your question was how do you find it? So for the listeners, I would say if you are in a place where everyone is very loyal to each other and feels persecuted by outsiders who don't understand you. So to create secrecy, you have to have a certain amount. The funny thing is there's often dot points in here that can also look like high-performing teams depending on how you're coming at it. So you have to have a huge amount of collegiality, but it'll usually be wrapped around your persecution and the lack of understanding. If you are in a place where everyone else doesn't get it and they're mean. So, and by that I mean, and I don't mean in this particular one, but in this one it would be that the LHN doesn't get it, no one else gets it, the minister, no one understands us.
Yeah.
And that continues to breed a place. So I like having teams where everyone's got everyone's back. Someone stuffs up, someone else helps them fix it up. Someone calls in sick, someone else goes to their meeting. That's a high-performing team. There is sometimes a cigarette paper between that and a team that will cover up for each other because everyone is in this mess
Together.
And so you need to be really careful because I think sometimes those places go from one to the other. And so where they start out as in that high performing way and then they're a line agency and they're being persecuted by Treasury and persecuted by DPC and all that kind of thing. And this stuff, so that's what can create that secrecy, which is a sense of loyalty to the joint and each other that supersedes your loyalty to your customer, to the rest of government, to all that other stuff.
There's some interesting research, I might have talked about it before, about kind of how an environment of psychological safety, which should include the ability to say, hey, Caroline, I'm not so sure about what you've done there.
That floor time doesn't look awesome.
And high performance are not always compatible. If you value, so famously NASA, high performing organisation, but were so committed to their identity as high performing that at various points in various scandals, the ability to say, hey guys, I'm not sure about this, was completely absent. So here we've got a toxic culture that aims to suppress things, but surely some complaints must have bubbled to the surface, right?
Yeah. Look, there is, in fact, a complaints management process. There's even a suggestions box, you'll be pleased to know. And it's worth sort of saying that the only member of kind of NALM, the local health network, as opposed to kind of Oakden, who has a finding of maladministration made against them, is the customer liaison officer, the person whose job it is to look at the complaints. So I thought, because this is one of our favourite topics, we'd spend some time exploring the ways in which his role went wrong. So he's asked to describe what his job was, and he sort of says, look, my job was to take complaints and find out what has happened. I have no authority to make changes, but I could make recommendations to senior management in corporate and in Oakden, and I could present at clinical governance meetings. I could conciliate and mediate, but I couldn't do anything. And I will just say the two things that I think make, like, that sounds familiar for lots of the poor customer complaint parts of an agency. Mm-hmm. But the two things that make, I think, his role a bit more comparable in this is, one, his office was at the facility. So remember I said there was actually there offices. Yeah. So he wasn't on the ward, but he was like at the closed hospital. And he also had former nursing qualifications. And so he did actually have some technical expertise.
To know good from bad.
Yeah. So what the ICAC finds is that this guy discharged his responsibilities by simply accepting information and explanations given to him by staff and passing them on to the complainant or reporter. He seems to have been of the opinion that complaints and reports should be fielded rather than investigated.
That's interesting.
I wondered about this. This made me think about a lot of complaints functions, kind of how you walk that line.
I mean, we've done complaints 1,000 times, so I won't reiterate my 100 points on this, but I go and say there's been a complaint, and whoever's in it says that's how we normally do it. That didn't happen. That's fine. And then I write my ministerial.
You don't know how hard this is, as you said before. Like people with dementia wander around. Of course, they bruise themselves.
This is not an uncommon kind of process for complaints, which is I have a complaint about Caroline's area. I ask her. She tells me the answer. It's not considered collegiate. It's not all sorts of things for me to say, like to query it and question it. I have to accept the face value of my senior colleague who says that's what happens, or this or whatever else, and then I write that in a bureaucratic way and respond to the complaint, and then I shut it, and then I meet my KPI.
Yep.
Is common and part of the problem.
And really cuts against, so health I think has a kind of, at least a formal commitment to a culture that's quite different on this from other parts of the public service, which is around clinical governance and continuous improvement and no blame.
Yeah.
And so that approach to complaints feels very, to me, like public servicey complaints, but actually not health complaints. Like health complaints are
typically...
celebrating kind of what do we learn from this? Okay, so this thing went wrong and we're going to review. Like that kind of clinical governance framework is supposed to, and I think does actually create a culture of kind of using complaints as a learning opportunity. That was not what was happening here.
But doesn't that also go to the fact that these are humans who don't fit into a single portfolio?
Yes.
And like aged care is different to health, which is different to mental health. And so the clinical governance of it, like, is it the clinical governance of a mental health facility? Is it the clinical governance of an aged care facility? And so the mess of that means that you end up with a complaints process that is different to how it would be normally done in health. But there's almost like a rationale for that, which is we're a bit different anyway.
I think that's right.
Yeah. But also you have complainants a bit like robo-debt, or maybe not like Robodette. So, like, none of the complainants are aware of the other complainants, right?
Oh, definitely that. Yeah, like they don't.
So my mum is not wearing the clothes that she was given. Mm-hmm. Is this an issue about how you're treating my mum? Rather than, so again, the only person really with that visibility of the consistency and pattern and systems and themes of the complaints is the complaint officer, the complaint receiver here. And so I do think it's not sufficient to field or even investigate the complaint if you're not doing that next level up work.
And he was preparing kind of monthly reports, sort of talking about complaint numbers.
That's my next question. Did you see anything about the reporting?
Yeah, and the commissioner, I should have written it down in my notes, but the commissioner sort of reads the reports, right? Because his defence to maladministration, like he's finding a maladministration is made against him, so he gets to put up a defence and he says, look, I prepared monthly reports to the clinical governance thing. And so the commissioner goes and reads them and he's like, they are high level. They do not speak to the specific
issues.
They do not speak. It's just like
complain about patient care.
Yep, exactly right.
Complaint about food.
And
complaint about
like and there's lots of them all the time. Like, okay, what does that say? Like it was exactly that process where you had to have someone who was curious. And they were never discussed at the meetings. So they were put on the meeting agendas, but no one ever discussed them. Apparently the meetings were very badly chaired by someone who also had maladministration found against. Like it's just all the things. No one wanted to know.
Yep. So how did it get uncovered in the end?
So a very amazing and brave woman called Barbara Spriggs, her husband is at Oakden and goes to the Royal Adelaide Hospital in February 2016 and very significant unexplained bruising is found on his hip. I don't know if you guys remember seeing it on the news. Yep. I remember seeing it on the news. It was awful. She makes a complaint through this process, and while that complaint is being, looked at, her husband dies of kind of pneumonia or some, kind of an aged, like something unrelated. But she doesn't give up. And so in June, she meets with the community visitor and asks for his help to get a response. And so he starts kind of calling the department and the minister's office. So we're 4 months out now, February to June. In August, the customer liaison officer finally writes his response. But the acting person, so this is when I'm saying happenstance, like let's just think about all these different things. So the acting person who is like signing that letter through to the chief executive to write back to Mrs. Spriggs says, I'm not going to sign this letter. Like that complaint looks really serious and this response doesn't seem to kind of respect the seriousness of that accusation.
Doesn't respond to this. So how often do you get a response to a complaint that doesn't actually address the complaint?
Exactly right. Like and so bravo to the acting person who won't do it. And in fact, that person sends an email to the CE of Narlan and says, just so you know, I won't sign off on this response. And so the CE of Narlan is like, there's something going on here. And she is, she's culpable for what's happening, but also she is like a little bit the kind of public service hero of this story because she sort of says, right, well, maybe I'll call up the chief psychiatrist and see if the chief psychiatrist could have a look at this complaint. So this is kind of in August. Now, look, sadly, something gets a bit lost in translation. She thinks she's asked the chief psychiatrist to look at it. He hasn't, and there's a whole blah, blah, blah. Ignore all of that. It kind of ticks on in limbo land until December, so February to December. Now we're in December. The minister's office is like, the community visitor keeps asking us about this letter. What's going on?
Squeaky wheel, right?
Yep, exactly right. The CE finally works out it's got a bit stuck and kind of, tries to unstick it. But she meets with Barbara Spriggs. That's her. She's like, this is so overdue. Actually, what I need to do is I need to apologise to this woman in person, even before the complaint is finalised. She meets with Barbara Spriggs on the 15th of December and 5 days later, she commissions the chief psychiatrist review that is going to close Oakden. And like she empowers that review. She puts people, she brings in, like she goes all out on it. That is how this gets uncovered. Mm-hmm. How easy would it have been for none of that to happen?
Yeah.
Don't you reckon?
And for just like, if it wasn't the acting person, if it was the regular person who was, I'm assuming, clearly in the practice of signing
them through, one
such
assumes.
responses, you know.
Yep. Yep, that's right. Or if the CE doesn't take the meeting with Barbara Spriggs and in the end just signs off there's just all these moments. Or if Barbara Spriggs stops asking for an answer.
Stops persisting and...
So we're in 2016. This is a very left of field reflection, which is it's kind of pre everyone, including baby boomers, having social media in their hands, and just made me think of the number of times I see kind of complaints about government service take off, and if lots of people are like, oh, but my dad's at Oakden too, and I was worried about that, but I was told they all get a party pie and they're really happy with it. And social media can be really unhelpful to good government service and all sorts of things. But the requiring of happenstance was also the lack of connection between everyone else having the same experience. And there is
social media is incredible at helping people find each other.
Yeah.
Very niche, dispersed,
but I don't
common
think,
interests.
I think here, though, what's happened is not necessarily the finding. It's the surfacing of the complaint. The happenstance for me is the CE who's willing to do the proper review.
Yeah.
Because it would have been really easy to do the not proper review.
Yeah.
And I just, you could have gaslit those families. I think she was just genuinely a principled person who had no sense of what was happening there. And then when she met with Barbara Spriggs and then went to the facility afterwards, Commissioner Lander talks about her being openly emotional as she heard as she walked around Oakden. And it is worth saying Commissioner Lander actually says, had she not commissioned this review, he would have found the minister guilty of maladministration because the minister had known about this for so long and had done nothing about it.
Yeah, right.
So she, at the very last moment, pulls something out.
Any final points on this one before we wrap it up?
I think that mental health and dementia is really, really systemically challenging, and because of that it can be senior leaders find it hard to look too closely at what it looks like at a human and a service delivery level, and that it's very hard for families to find the space to advocate, and the space and the fear of losing your service, and that we have to have better eyes on practice on the ground, and what that looks like I think is still contested when it comes to whether it's CCTV, walking the floor, governance models. It's not contested, but which one's better, which one will work, I think is not, we don't have a consensus on. I find it all horrifically sad because in general, we are talking about the most incredibly vulnerable people, and perhaps our risk and our governance approach to things is less universal. Perhaps what we consider governance depends on the vulnerability of the service that we provide, because we can make mistakes in government, and we can do it by accident, we can do it on purpose, we can do it with malfeasance, and that's all inside baseball. And yet, it really is a marker of who we are as a community and a government, how we treat the most vulnerable people in our care.
Yeah, it really makes me think of some of the terrible residential care and child protection scandals, like the one in the UK, which has resurfaced again with Keir Starmer, but the Rotherham scandal around the grooming of vulnerable girls in state care. And just as you were talking, Danielle, it did make me think, I think we should apply a different standard of scrutiny and risk. I sadly think we do apply a different standard of scrutiny and risk in the wrong way. And I think we are institutionally a little bit, it's like that's what kids like that do. You can't stop that. Anyway, I think it is really hard when government systems rub up against these questions. This is very sad. I'm finding this one really sad.
Yeah.
Well, this is the last of our mini-series on Oakden. So we will be back in the next episode with perhaps some lighter fare as we return with a mini-series on recruitment. Till next time.
Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions, or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.